Hi everyone, my name is Meaghan Brunk. Today I'm going to talk to you guys about the difference between phenotype and genotype, and I'm also going to tell you guys the difference between heterozygous and homozygous traits. So the objectives for today are to distinguish phenotype and genotype and also differentiate between homozygous and heterozygous traits. So to start off, an organism's phenotype is the observable or physical characteristics of an individual. So a phenotype is something that you can see, a physical characteristic or a trait that you can actually observe on an organism, and specifically what it looks like. I went ahead and I underlined the pH in phenotype and also in physical. I use this as a tool to recognize that a phenotype is talking about a physical characteristic. And I use this as a little bit of a hint to remember that phenotype is referring to something that you can see. So if you're going to determine the phenotype of this person's eye, it's going to be that their eye color is blue. And same thing for this example. If you're going to determine the phenotype for this person, and the trait is talking about freckles, the phenotype for this person is that they have freckles. So now it gets a little bit trickier when you start to talk about genotype. Genotype is when you are talking about the entire set of genes that an organism has. So again, I did a little bit of a hint here, genotype and genes. So for example, there are a set of alleles that determine the expression of a particular trait, so phenotype or characteristics. So I'm going to talk to you guys about alleles, which is what makes up a genotype of an organism. So with alleles, we have two different kinds of alleles. We have dominant and we also have recessive. So an allele is one member of a pair of genes at a specific spot on a chromosome that controls the same trait. So a pair of genes. You always have at least two alleles for every single trait. So an example here would be that a pair of alleles controlling freckles can have three possible combinations, so genotypes. You can have one allele that's carrying freckles and the other allele that also says freckles. You can have another combination where one has freckles and then the other one is no freckles. And then you can have another genotype where you have an allele that is no freckles and the other allele is also no freckles. Out of those three genotypes, there are only a possibility for two phenotypes, meaning you can either have freckles or you can't. And I'll talk to you guys in 1 second about how that's determined. So a dominant trait is represented by a capital letter, and in this particular circumstance, the dominant trait is having freckles. And so I have it labeled here. I'll do a close-up for you to see this. And so I did just mention that the dominant trait in a person's genotype is going to be represented with a capital letter. So what that means is a dominant trait is the allele that always shows. So the allele that determines an organism's phenotype. It always masks the recessive allele or gene when it is present. Whenever the dominant trait is present, it's as if the recessive allele does not exist. And so the only time that a recessive allele is going to show up in a person's physical phenotype is when they only have recessive alleles and no dominant alleles. So a recessive allele is a gene or allele that's phenotypic expression is always masked by the dominant allele when it is present. And so there are two different types of combinations of genotypes. You can either have a heterozygous genotype or a homozygous genotype. So for this one, I also broke down the word so it helps you understand what the word is. Hetero means different, so that is a little bit of a hint. A heterozygous organism for a particular trait contains two different alleles for that particular trait. So there's only one possible genotype for a heterozygous individual. A heterozygous individual has one dominant allele and one recessive allele. So two different alleles. If you look at this genotype, it has a dominant allele, which means that it will always show up in that person's phenotype, meaning that person is always going to resemble the dominant allele if they're carrying it. A homozygous individual, again, I broke it down. Homo means the same. So the prefix homo means the same. Again, that's a hint. A homozygous organism for a particular trait means two copies of the same allele for that particular trait. So in this circumstance, we do have two options for the genotype. We can have two dominant alleles, which means that that person is going to show that dominant allele. Their phenotype is going to resemble the dominant allele. And also we have an option for homozygous recessive, meaning we have two recessive alleles. So in this case, this is the only case that we are going to see an individual that is displaying the recessive trait as their phenotype. And so here I drew two examples. I'm going to cover up the answer a little more. Sorry about that. So in this first example over here, we have a person that's phenotype is without freckles. So what are the possible genotypes for a person that does not have any freckles? So again, not having freckles is recessive. So that means that they cannot have the dominant trait. And then on this side, we have a person that has freckles. So if they have freckles, all that means is that at least one of their alleles has the dominant trait in it. So that being said, the person without freckles can only have two recessive traits. The person with freckles has to have two dominant or one dominant and one recessive. In that case, this one here is homozygous recessive. This one here is homozygous dominant. So we have two alleles that are the same, but they're both dominant. And then here we have a heterozygous individual, meaning that there are two different alleles. All right, so that's my presentation on phenotypes and genotypes. So again, to wrap that up, a phenotype is an organism's physical characteristics, so what you can see about them. A genotype is their genetic makeup, so the alleles that that particular person has in their genes. Also, when we're looking at homozygous and heterozygous genes, we are going to have different types of homozygous and heterozygous genotypes. For homozygous genotypes, we can either have a homozygous dominant, meaning we have two dominant alleles, or we can have homozygous recessive, meaning we have two recessive alleles. Having homozygous recessive alleles is the only way that you are ever going to see a recessive phenotype. And then heterozygous is when you have two alleles that are different. All right, I hope that I cleared up some misconceptions with these concepts, and I hope you have a better understanding of them now. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time.